This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. And today is the second episode in a two-part series interviewing the inaugural winners of the AASA prizes. There are currently two AASA prize categories, but there are more coming up in the future, and these were established by Siobhan O'Sullivan. These are only open to AASA members, so if you are not a member, you should sign up now. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a really valuable series of academic books about animal studies. If you're working on a book at the moment, why not consider reaching out to see if it would be a good fit with the series? The series editors are Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, Melissa Boyd and Yvette Watt. In this episode, I'm speaking to Dr. Brodie Evans. Brodie is a visiting fellow at the Centre for Justice at Queensland University of Technology, though he also works full-time in a non-university job, something we'll talk about a little later on. Brodie is contesting and reinforcing the future of meat through problematization, analysing the discourses in regulatory debates around animal cell-cultured meat, which was co-authored with Dr. Hope Johnson, was the winner of the 2021 AASA Journal Article by an Early Career Researcher Prize. It was published in the journal Geoforum in 2021, and I'm really excited to be talking to Brodie about the paper today. Welcome to the podcast, Brodie.
Thanks very much, Josh.
So can you start by telling me what inspired you to work on this particular topic?
Particular topic is, I guess, a long story. To keep it brief, I guess, my passion for research and teaching in this space has been around activism and anti-oppression work. My early 20s, I was, certainly involved in a lot of community activist work, as a good queer art student often is. I was involved in our local organising pro-choice collective in Brisbane, and we were doing a lot of activism around a trial at the time where a woman was charged with illegally procuring a termination. And I think from that, at that time I became vegan, started looking at a bit more around anti-oppression and liberation discourse and things like that. And I think the passion for animal rights came from that. And when it came to deciding on what my PhD thesis was going to be on, I wanted to shift gears away from reproductive rights. Though I am still passionate about that, I wanted to work on something different, and a focus on animal cruelty and animal rights ended up becoming the topic of my research, and that's carried me through now post PhD. And I think with this current paper, it builds on a lot of the work that I had started in my PhD, looking at the constructions and understandings of animal cruelty. And from that, I was looking at a lot around human-human dynamics and how they impact on our understanding of animal cruelty and how they impact on responses to animal cruelty issues. And I think that's just kind of, it goes in lots of different directions that I could take that. But certainly looking at the cell-cultured meat space or the lab-grown meat space, again, we're looking at a lot of human dynamics around food security and food accessibility and environmentalism and a lot of things like that are, human-centered issues that are still impacting on animal-centered issues, animal-centered policy responses. So I'm really interested in kind of how they're intersecting and, what gets prioritized and how it shapes our understanding of the use of animals. So it's kind of flowed on from that but from that animal-centered or critical animal perspective on the work.
Let's start by getting clear about what you're doing in this paper. So this is the discourse analysis of a public meeting in the United States. Could you introduce us to the meeting in question and as well to the idea of discourse analysis as you're using it here?
Sure. So, I mean, that particular case study that we looked at was kind of one of the first regulatory spaces, particularly, in America, certainly, but looking at how labeling was going to be, a matter, how we should be regulating the safety of the production of animal cell cultured meat. There was a lot of key issues that were being brought ahead as we discussed kind of in the paper, and our interest was Hope and I. Our interest in this was analyzing where the interest of animals was coming through here, and it was another kind of case compared to when we were looking at the live export policy debates. And from our perspective, we saw it, these are opportunities for animal-centered scholars or animal-centered activists to be entering policy debates that are going to have a real impact on animal lives. This is an opportunity. And so I think for us, we're really looking at, okay, well, what role can we play in this space? And then when we're analyzing people who are doing this, that are entering this space, what role are they having? So for us, we found that a lot of the animal activists, when we're looking at their language, how they're interacting with the other, I guess, I'm trying not to use jargon or anything, but the promises that lab grown meat is meant to provide, the idea that it's going to end all animal suffering, those kind of large promises that are made, how the people that are playing or navigating those promissory discourses in this space. And we found that what we would have liked to have seen in these policy debates was missing, that this real critical voice of saying, hey currently there's no way to produce this without animals being harmed, that we're talking about bringing a product to market that can't deliver on what it's trying to accomplish. And animal activists in this space weren't really bringing that critical perspective. They were, largely buying into this and saying, and arguably the idea that it will reduce suffering in another industry. So for us, we're, really looking at it from the perspective of what's missing here, and how can we kind of have a call to arms for other activists and scholars to start entering these policy discussions. We want you to be entering these policy discussions, but to be, I guess, a bit more critical, to be a bit, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but I guess it's just, what role can we play in bringing animal interests to the forefront, really, and not buying into hypotheticals around how their lives are going to be impacted.
I see. So this meeting, it has policymakers, it has animal activists, presumably it has representatives of animal industry and the cellular agriculture industry as well. So they're all coming together, and what you're doing is you're trying to work out what they're saying, but perhaps more crucially, what they're not saying at this meeting.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at, what's being constructed as a problem here. What's lab grown meat trying to solve? And, we make it clear, well, the suffering of animals, if that's the problem, then if the solution requires animal suffering, there's a mixed match there. So we rely on Carol Backey's work around problematization. So we're really looking here around, what's being constructed as a problem, and then noticeably what's not being constructed as a problem, and what's the solution and what's not the solution being proposed here. There isn't a discussion around plant-based products being the solution to animal suffering, to environmental issues, or to food safety issues. So our discourse analysis in this paper is really looking at what's being problematized, what's being said is the issue that needs to be solved here. And because of the way that it's been set up, lab-grown meat gets put out there as the solution, and we're critical of that.
I see. So at this meeting, you've got this contrast between cultivated meat and what we might call conventional or slaughter-based meat, but there isn't the contrast between cultivated meat as an element of a food system and a kind of solely plant-based future. Do you think that this meeting was the right place to have that broader conversation?
Yes, because I think the broader conversations around food accessibility was had here, and so there was discussions around, okay, population growth, and the demand for protein, how are we going to address that? And so they are talking about the problem. So if we're engaging with that problem, why aren't we discussing all the solutions? There definitely was space for those conversations, and if it's not this forum, where? I guess we're coming from the perspective of, how can we capitalize on these moments? How can we capitalize on these spaces where these debates are having? Because animal interests are being talked about here. It is being talked about that traditional or slaughter-based production is causing animal suffering, and this is going to be the solution to that animal suffering. So that is part of the debates. That conversation is being had in this space. So, I think that's a prime opportunity to talk about, to have a critical voice there of saying this might be one option. It might be a way that's going to reduce suffering, but currently bringing it to the market when there is still current animals being harmed in its production we need to be transparent about that when we're talking about what needs to be put on a label, or how are we marketing it to the populace. So I think, I definitely think that this was a space or an opportunity, and the conversations were being had here, and there were animal activists in this space having that conversation. So it's just kind of showing a different lens on what we noticed and what we didn't notice.
Yes, I see. And I was wondering when I was reading the paper about what kinds of reasons these activists who were present might give for playing into the narratives that have been set up rather than presenting this kind of radical critical view, which is the sort of thing that you're suggesting is lacking. I mean, I personally have sat on these kinds of panels. I've been called as an expert witness. That's not quite the right term, it's too legalistic, but I'm sure you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
And I faced exactly this tension because I thought, on the one hand, of course, I want to present a kind of radical perspective. But on the other hand, I want to be able to have an influence. And I remember I personally went the radical route. And the first thing I said was, look, I'm not sure I should even be here. The particular example I'm thinking about, we were talking about genetic editing of farm animals. I said, I'm not even sure I should be here because I don't want to legitimate animal farming at all, which is what this technology seems to do. And that seems to be a similar thing that you're suggesting about cultivated meat, right? It legitimates meat-based food systems when we should be championing plant-based food systems. So I suppose this is all a kind of long-winded way of saying, do you think there might be room for moderating what we're saying in order to get at the table, stay at the table, and to have an impact on those around the table?
Yeah, and I think, there's ways to do that. I guess we've all probably had that experience, even just at the dinner table with family members. Christmas is looming in my mind. Even in this space, I'd be very keen to just be having that voice, bringing up the conversation of, should we be talking about bringing this to market if we can't currently do what we're hoping to do by the time it gets to market. Like it's still talking about going to market where we eventually don't need to use fetal serum, how about we get to that point first and then we'll talk about how we can regulate it to market, bring it to market, so I think, there's ways that you can probably engage in the conversation that isn't completely writing off an industry, but that still says like, no, I see your goal. How can we help you get that goal? Because right now you're not there. And so maybe there's a way to engage with that, certainly. But I think it's, there's always going to be, from my perspective, power in having resistant discourses in this space. I think there's always, there's still an importance there in having resistant and counter narratives in these debates. And I think, eventually that grows and grows. So, and it inspires and it motivates. And it pushes. So I think there's always, from my perspective, there's value in the radical because it makes the moderate sometimes more likely to achieve. If you've only got the moderate, you're probably actually going to get closer to what you don't want at all. So I think I think we need both. I think we need the moderates and we need the radicals in these debates. That's a very pragmatic approach, I believe, in terms of activism and where it gets you. I'm not saying that we need everyone to be radical, but I think their perspective is definitely, it pushes.
Yes, and you're introducing here or raising here another real problem with the discourse as you conceptualize it and as you see it. It's not just the case that the issue of plant-based food systems was left off the table, but also the fact that existing problems with the cell-cultured meat industry were apparently left off the table. So you mentioned fetal bovine serum. And so the worry seems to be that it's taken for granted that cell cultured meat is harm free, when in fact that's a possible future and certainly not a current present.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's very much the activists are pretty much on board of, yes, this is going to happen. This is the goal and it's going to be great. I love the optimism, but I'm not there. I'm just not there. So I just think definitely think there needed to be some counter discourses there around from that animal activist perspective. It was very hopeful, and yet we were talking about it actually being brought to market and how we regulate this. And yeah, that was it. Yeah, it's very much this is the goal. But how do we know that instead we're not going to have a free range bovine serum? And like, how do we know they're not going to still bring it to market, but make it somehow that this is sustainable bovines? Like as if we've got like sustainable palm oil. How do we know that that's what we're actually going to get if we don't resist now? It's going to be so much harder to resist when it's actually on the market.
Yes, I feel this tension quite acutely because, as you may well know, and as many listeners may well know, I'm something of an advocate of cultured meat. But I say that with the caveat, the very important caveat, and I think you would be right to press me on this caveat, that there are a lot of problems with cultured meat as it is currently produced and as the industry is currently structured and the direction it's currently going. And lots of people, when we take fetal bovine serum as a classic example, everyone in the industry says, oh, we need to overcome this. This is not something that's going to be there. But I think you're quite right to say, well, says who? We need to overcome this. Great, but we haven't overcome it yet. Or at least we've only taken the first steps towards overcoming it. And it might be a great idea that we won't have it, but until we don't have it, we can't know for sure that we won't. And so I understand what you say, that it is premature to start talking about, well, what was it they were talking about in the meeting? They're talking about labeling, for example. So it might be premature to talk about labeling when we still haven't solved what everyone claims to be such a big problem, which is fetal bovine serum. So what other things were there that were constructed as problems, that were presented as things to be discussed at this meeting? One of them was labelling. One of them was questions about bringing it to market. What other kinds of things were raised as problems or constructed as problems?
Yeah, so like food security, for example. So the idea that we are going to solve global hunger through lab grown meat. I'm being a bit bitter now, but I think the idea that this is going to be the magic and that's going to solve food accessibility issues, that it's going to solve food safety issues, and global food security, those kind of things. It was very much put up as this is going to be the solution to all those problems.
In your conclusion, you stress, and this is something that's come up in our conversation in a big way, you stress the need for, quote, animal-centred voices at the table. But the USDA and the FCA, who are calling this joint meeting, might say that they did have animal activists present. So, for example, they had Paul Shapiro, who's former president of the Humane Society. There was a 2 times Knowing Animals guest, Ilan Abrel, and Erica Meyer, who's the former president of Compassion Over Killing. They were all present, and I think there were others as well. So what does including animal-centred voices look like, if not including people like those academics and activists?
And that's why I said I don't want to throw anyone under the microscope. But I think, our paper really highlights what animal-centered voices could look like in this space and was absent in this space. So that's not to say that the people that were there aren't animal-centered, and it might be the case that they read our paper and are inspired to think about things in a different way, or might reflect on their activist strategies in this space, or it might be encouraging other voices that aren't here to come to the table, and it's not necessarily even looking at the case study of America, but when inevitably we have these conversations in Australia, what kind of voices do we want at the table in this space, or in the UK, or anything like that? So I think it wasn't intentionally meant to say that these animal activists weren't good enough, and that was something that we definitely tried to not make our conclusion. It was more, these are the questions that we had raised after these questions came to us after we had read the discourses, and really kind of highlighting this is what we felt was missing, or this is what was the impact of the language that was being used, or the truths that were being claimed and taken up, and what's the impact of that on when it comes to a policy response. So I think it was shining a bigger a bigger picture. I think when you're actually in that space and actually having those conversations, you don't necessarily know what the impact that's going to be, on the larger, what's going to be taken up by the policy response. So I think it was trying to provide that bigger picture, and hopefully it inspires people to think critically when they are encountering those truth claims from industry.
Now, before we move on to our regular questions, I wanted to ask a bit about your day job. I say this because I know that a lot of listeners are early career academics who might well be asking questions about what animal studies research means career-wise. So, although you're a researcher with a social sciences PhD, you work full-time outside of academia. So, could you quickly introduce us to your current job and explain how you came to have it?
Sure. So my current job title is Men's Program Coordinator, and I coordinate and facilitate domestic violence perpetrator intervention group programs. So we're talking about men using violence in their intimate partner relationships, and doing behaviour change work essentially. And I started there with a part-time role while I was doing my PhD, and then after I graduated, then became full-time in the facilitator and coordinator role. For others, it might look like quite different to my research passion, but for me, again, I spoke about, the roots of my animal activism is from that, anti-oppression and very much pro-feminist work. So for me, it wasn't that much of a shift, and there's the guiding principle of being around promoting justice and equity and equality. So for me, it was it still aligns very much with my broader passions, but I think it does speak to having 10 years in the game in academia of teaching and research, and there not being a job at the end of that. I think there's definitely a difficult space, I think, for animal researchers, in terms of still feeling a bit on the fringe sometimes, in depending on what your individual universities like and what they prioritize, and or even just the tension that you have with some, there was a postdoc opportunity that came up, but it was for the meat industry, and they wanted someone that was going to bring that critical animal centered perspective to the work, but I still couldn't reconcile it ethically, so I didn't even throw my hat in the ring. So I think there's those kind of opportunities and tensions that I think sometimes animal researchers encounter when it comes to full-time work. But yeah, so I do the full-time DV work, and then do my research part-time on weekends and nights.
So obviously that introduces a real time constraint when it comes to doing research. But are there other ways that having the job impacts your academic work?
I mean, when I first started, I was still teaching as well on top of that. I've cut back this year from teaching and just do some guest lectures every now and then. But when I was still teaching, for me, it enriches the work because I was able to draw on real real world. I was able to draw on the community-based work that I was doing, and it enriched my teaching. And I think the students really valued that as well, because I was able to speak to it in terms of a vocation. I was able to speak to, what they're learning and how it can impact on different roles they might have in the future. So for me, it enriches my teaching practice. And in terms of research, I've also had the opportunity to do publications around domestic violence, and I'm currently working on a book chapter around that. So, it's led to opportunities. It's still that kind of that weird position where do I stick to a niche, or do I, you end up having a lot of different publications in a lot of different areas, and maybe that will be a hindrance. But I like the balance.
So, Brodie, every guest on Knowing Animals is asked 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure, go for it.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, it probably would have been Carol Adams' The Sexual Politics of Meat.
I thought you might say that.
Oh, really? Yes, I am predictable.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Does my PhD application count?
Yeah, so what was your PhD application on?
Yeah, I mean, so it was looking at animal cruelty in the live export trade, so it didn't divert too much from that, but I was looking at it originally from an ecofeminist perspective, and that eventually changed using a Foucauldian lens. But yeah, that was probably the first time that I really kind of focused on pro-animal scholarship.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
only because it's awkward if she hears. Probably Professor Christine Parker. Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of her work during my PhD studies. She does a lot of work around language and labeling and, the politics and ethics of food regulation. And so, I referenced her in my PhD, and she ended up being one of my assessors, and that was pretty awesome. I think it was just really validating, and I think also because she's an Aussie, but she works in Australia. I think having someone even in a different state, but very much passionate about what I'm doing, and then giving me positive feedback. It felt very motivating to stay on this trajectory, which I think a lot of PhD scholars sometimes, at the end are kind of, oh, do I want to keep doing this or do I don't? Is there going to be work for me? Is there not? So having that crisis of faith, I'm sure a lot do. And definitely she was very motivating to keep doing this work. And I'm now co-writing a paper with her. I still very much, in a way, kick myself, but also try to play it very cool. And try not to fanboy too hard. But it is very, very cool.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I mean, with a question like that, I often want to say, don't eat them. That would be a great start. But I think, for my work, I very much think of, how can I be of service? And so thinking about those potential public consultations or policy submissions, and where can I lend my expertise to avenues that is essentially service work, and thinking about that. But I think we need more pro animal academics. So I think we need to be elevating and encouraging scholars in universities. So I think whether it maybe is in your role as a PhD supervisor and uplifting those workers underneath you. So I think if you're involved in unit design or curriculum design, being advocates in that space of having an animal-centered unit, whether it's in criminology or law or politics or justice, if you've got any influence there of using that influence, and if you don't get the big wins around a standalone unit, it's how can you include case examples in your traditional, more broad-based units. So as a role as an educator, you've got so many students in front of you that you're able to influence, and they're potentially the next animal scholar down the track. So I think if you're in a teaching space and you're in a space where you can create opportunities for students to think about animals and to influence minds, so I think using that is definitely something that academics, I hope, do.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I'm very passionate about ending the exploitation of animals for entertainment, for human entertainment and gambling. So for me, seeing an end to horse racing and greyhound racing and calf roping and rodeos, that would be kind of, I'd love it if we could end the use of animals for human entertainment. I think whether that's in Australia, it does not feel like an easy win, but it still feels maybe easier than trying to end their use for food, or medical research. So I think, if we could try to end greyhound racing, if we could try to end their exploitation in that avenue, that's something that I'm definitely very passionate about.
What are you working on next?
I have a few papers. I'm doing one with Hope Johnson and Christine Parker around the recent Australian policy debates around the labelling of plant-based quote-unquote meat. So we're doing a paper around that. I'm also doing a paper with Erin O'Brien and Hope, again, with looking at Extinction Rebellion and its relationship to the state in an Australian context. And then I've got a couple of things around domestic violence perpetrator work.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I do have a website, so you can go to www.brodieevans.com. Otherwise, you can always flick me an email, which is brodieevans13@gmail.com. Always happy to talk animals.
Well, thanks, Brodie, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about it and to review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you found us. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.